to the Jewish Christian Studies podcast. This program is sponsored by King's Evangelical Divinity School. And now, here's your host, Ruben Gomez.
Dr. Gerald McDermott is an Anglican theologian. He teaches at Jerusalem Seminary and the Reformed Episcopal Seminary in Philadelphia. He retired from the Anglican Chair of Divinity at Beeson Divinity School in Birmingham, Alabama, in 2020. He has taught many courses in the history of Christianity and Christian theology of world religions, and written, co-written, or edited 25 books and hundreds of articles. McDermott and his wife Jean attend Holy Cross Anglican in Crozet, Virginia, where he serves as priest in residence. He lectures and podcasts frequently, and he and his wife have 3 grown sons and 14 grandchildren. One of the focuses of his academic research has been the meaning of Israel, and among his many books, there is one in particular titled Israel Matters: Why Christians Must Think Differently About the People and the Land, which is very relevant to our conversation today. Dr. McDermott, Gerald, it's a pleasure having you today with us.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gomez. It's a great privilege for me.
As you know, we want to talk about supersessionism. Now, this is a word which is often used, but many times it is not defined. So could you please provide us with a working definition of supersessionism so that everybody's on the same page?
Sure, Professor. I like to talk about supersessionism in 2 parts. First part has to do with the people, and the second part has to do with the land. So the first part, the Jewish people. Supersessionism says basically that God's affections for the Jewish people, the Jewish Israel, have been superseded by his new, so to speak, affections for the Gentile church. This is pretty much the same thing as replacement theology. God's devotion to the Gentile church has now replaced his devotion to his affections for the Jewish people. So whereas God made what the Old Testament says over and over again was an eternal covenant with the Jewish people to be his people forever, to be the chosen people forever, as long as Jeremiah says, as long as the sun and the stars and the moon are in the sky. And I'm looking out now, I'm in Virginia, it's 12:30 p.m. I'm looking out at a blue sky and a very bright day. The sun is still in the sky.
Right.
But supersessionism says that eternal covenant where God said, you Jewish people, descendants of Abraham, are going to be my chosen people forever, that's been superseded. Hence the term supersessionism has been superseded because in 30 AD, after the resurrection of Jesus, it became very clear that most Jews did not accept Jesus as a Messiah. Therefore, God, the Father, broke off that covenant with the Jewish people and transferred all the promises of the covenant to the Gentile church. So that's the first part, the people. So the second part is the land. Whereas until 30 AD, the land of Israel was the promised land and the center, really, of God's, you might say, geographical focus on the planet all through the Old Testament. After 30 AD, and most Jews rejected Jesus as Messiah, or as Messiah, God then turned his gaze, you might say, to all the nations of the world. And now, after 30 AD, after the resurrection of Jesus, the land of Israel is no longer the promised land. So God's love for all the lands of the world, you might say, has superseded his earlier preference or focus on the land of Israel. So that's how I define supersessionism.
So, having said that, why would you say it is so important to deal with the question of supersessionism in the church today?
Well, I'll make a very strong response, Professor Gomez, to that question. And I'll say, because of the links of supersessionism to the Holocaust. Now, that might sound harsh. It might sound overly dramatic. It might sound like just another conspiracy theory. But I would argue it can be traced in history because of its logic. The logic of supersessionism is that God is done with the Jews because they were stubborn and perfidious. And if God is done with the Jews because they're stubborn and perfidious, and actually are the Christ killers, as the church taught from the 4th century, Constantine, all the way up through Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, the Roman Catholic document in Vatican II, which reversed all that about the Jewish people and said we should not refer to them as Christ killers. But from the 4th century through the 20th century, and still many Christians today still think like that, all Jews are Christ killers. Who could think of anything worse than killing the Messiah?
Exactly.
Than killing Christ. And if Jews are responsible for that, by golly, and especially now, since October 7th, 2023, surge in anti-Semitism all over the world, Professor, I would say, to deal with the question of supersessionism in the Christian churches today, because it has deadly consequences.
Right, very much so. Don't you think, though, that many Christians aren't even aware of their history? I mean, they don't understand supersessionism because it's so to speak, the default mode of being a Christian.
Absolutely. It's the default mode that they've heard in the sermons as they sit in the pews and listen to their preachers, most of whom are supersessionists, because they've sat in their seminaries and been taught supersessionism by their professors. So it goes up the ecclesial and academic food chain up to the top, the scholars, most of whom have been, and even to this day, are supersessionists.
Right. Now, one thing that I hear from people quite often is something like this. Now that Jesus, the Messiah, not just the Jewish Messiah, but our Messiah, the Savior of the whole world, now that he has come, what is the point? Is there any need of distinguishing between Israel and everybody else, between Israel and the nations? What would you respond to that?
Right, because according to supersessionists, Jesus broke down all those barriers. Paul said in Galatians 3:28, hey, there's neither Jew nor Greek anymore. So there shouldn't be any distinctions in the church between Jews and Gentiles anymore. Doesn't the New Testament teach it? My answer to that question is no, the New Testament does not teach that. In fact, it teaches quite the opposite. Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament continue from Matthew through the book of Revelation to distinguish between Jews and Gentiles. And let me just give you a few examples. Paul famously in Romans 11 makes clear distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. He refers to believing Jews as natural branches in the olive tree. Now, what's the olive tree? The olive tree was the primary Old Testament symbol of Israel. Paul in Romans 11 refers to Gentiles as wild olive shoots. And he warned the Gentiles. Now, this is Romans, his last major, before he's martyred, his last major, most extensive, most systematically theological comment reflection on the relation between Jews and Gentiles, letter to the Romans. And the majority of the people in the Church of Rome were Gentiles. They had a minority of Jews, and the Jews, even in that church, were being despised by their Gentile pewmates, people at the other end of the pew, speak. Even then. And he tells the Gentiles in Rome, he said, don't be arrogant toward the branches. Now here he's referring to the Jews who don't believe in Jesus. And there are plenty of Jews in Rome who did not believe in Jesus, who were not members of the church. But he warns the Gentiles in the church of Rome, don't be arrogant toward those branches that were broken off because of their unbelief in the Jewish Messiah, by thinking that the nourishing root of the olive tree does not support you. In other words, even though they're broken up branches, and you would think, therefore, that Israel is no longer important. No, it's the olive tree of Israel that still supports you. You don't support it. And later in that chapter of Romans 11, Paul writes in the present tense, not the past tense. He says the Jews, and he's referring specifically here to the Jews who did not accept Jesus as Messiah. I've told him 1,000 times. It's not a minor thing. It's the number two thing in the promise in the twofold promise that God made to Abraham. I'm giving you sons and I'm giving you a land. So the promises are twofold. Well, we said the gifts and calling are irrevocable, cannot be revoked. And what's the calling? That you Jewish people are my chosen people. That cannot be revoked. So Paul is saying here, and he's probably writing this in 57 AD. Few years before he's martyred in Rome. And he's already been a Messianic believer for at least 25 years. Now, of Jews, perhaps over 100,000 Jews are Messianic believers around the Roman Empire. I've got a new book out and I talk about that. The evidence for this. Nevertheless, it was still less than 50% of the Jews in the Roman Empire. There were probably about 2 million. Very, very populous people back then, and a very attractive religion back then. And they were missionaries, unlike today. Unlike Jews today are not missionaries except for Messianic Jews. But Jews back then were missionaries, and their religion was extremely attractive to the Gentiles around the Roman Empire. In chapter 1, the angel comes to Mary and tells her that she's going to be the mother of the Messiah. And he says, this child of yours is going to reign over the house of Jacob forever. Now, Luke is writing, there's debates when Luke was writing his gospel, maybe after the destruction of Jerusalem, so maybe after 70. So this is 40 years, perhaps, down the road when Luke is writing, and Luke is still making distinctions between Jews and Gentiles, or he's putting those words in the angel's mouth, which means there are still distinctions being made. Simeon, in Luke's account in chapter 2, says he sees a light that is a revelation to the Gentiles, but also for glory to your people, Israel. Exactly. 40 years after the resurrection, Luke twice now is making clear distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. Jesus himself, in Matthew's gospel, once again, probably written about 40 years down the road, says that I'm going to come back. I'm going to sit on my glorious throne, and you apostles, you 12 apostles will judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus himself is talking about Israel here in the future, the 12 tribes of Israel in the future. He's not breaking down distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. And I think Jesus is a pretty good authority. And look at the book of Revelation. Now, even the preterists, those who say the book of Revelation is only about things that happened in the first century, not about the long-term future. Nevertheless, it's talking about even the preterists will concede that Revelation is talking about at least the near-term future and the rest of this first century. And there, the author of Revelation, I think it was John, whoever the author was, says 144,000, who are they? They're coming from every tribe of the sons of Israel. They're all Jews. And they will be distinct from this other great multitude, also mentioned in chapter 7 of Revelation, that cannot be counted from every nation. These are the Gentiles. So two different crowds in the future, in the eschaton, whether it was the first century, end of the first century, and I think, I'm not a preterist. I don't agree with them. I don't think their case holds. I think he's clearly talking about the eschaton. And in the eschaton, clear distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. So even in the end of days, the distinction between Jews and Gentiles. And Paul, by the way, his last major, closest thing we have to a systematic theology from Paul, the book of Romans. At the end of the book of Romans, chapter 15, he's still distinguishing in chapter 15, verses 8 and 9, between the circumcised Jews and Gentiles.
Quite a survey of New Testament material there. Yeah. So, I mean, one wonders, how can people not see that particular evidence? I remember in one of your books or an interview, you've often said that you yourself and other people have been taught not to see certain things in the New Testament with regards to Israel. I think that's a very interesting idea that makes us think about what we hear from pastors and preachers and professors. Would you mind to elaborate a little bit on that particular idea? What do you mean by taught not to see? I mean, aren't we supposed to be taught to see?
Well, I'll start out, Professor, by saying I'm a sinner. I'm a theological sinner. That is, I was a supersessionist for years and years. Look, I was trained in the New Testament at the University of Chicago Divinity School. I was trained in historical theology and Jewish theology and Christian theology at the University of Iowa. And I was taught by my professors, Supersessionism. And I became a disciple of my good friend, and he is my good friend still, Tom Wright, otherwise known as N.T. Wright.
N.T. Wright.
Who is there's no doubt about it. He is the most influential theologian and biblical scholar in the world today, bar none. He has huge influence on the Catholic world. And Tom Wright, I love him. He truly is a man of God. We both are Anglicans, and I've hosted him for several days on 2 different occasions. And his wife is a friend of my wife, but he knows that I disagree with him on Israel. And he's a supersessionist. Now, he denies he's a supersessionist by redefining the term. But I was told by all my professors, for instance, that the land promise drops out of the New Testament. That is nowhere in the New Testament. I believed it. It made sense. And Tom Wright is so brilliant. He's one of the few true geniuses I've ever known in my life. He truly is a genius. But about 25 years ago, like you, Professor, I was leading a tour of Israel, and it was a church group. And my guide was a young guy. And, for me, anybody under 65 is really young. But he was really, really young. I think he was in his late 20s at the time, and he was working on a PhD at Hebrew University. And we would go to the sites up in Galilee, along the Mediterranean, and in Jerusalem, down to the Dead Sea. And I would give my spiel, I'm as a professor of theology and a professor of the New Testament. And he, very humbly, he wouldn't say anything while I was talking to the little crowd. It became very clear what he was telling me was that everything I was saying was wrong because I was missing so much. And of course, I was very humble. And I went home and I wrote down these titles he gave me. And I went home and I read them more. And those more that I read led me to more. And I went deeper and deeper and deeper. And I started rethinking everything. And after a while, after a couple of years of this, I started to see the New Testament differently, the whole Bible differently, Jesus differently, and the meaning of the gospel differently.
That's so wonderful. But did it cause you problems when you actually, I was going to say converted, but I'm not sure what
version. Yes, it's a theological conversion.
It's a theological conversion of sorts, right?
Yeah.
So because you've been professor for many, many years, you still teach theology, as we said in our introduction. Did it cause you problems with your peers, your colleagues, or the institutions that you taught at? The fact that you changed your perspective on Israel?
Oh, yeah. Jonathan Edwards, famously said, "I'm a man born to strife." He was always involved in theological conflict. And of course, he got that line from Jeremiah. I learned you're reading Jeremiah. That's where he got it from. And I've been a man born to strife. I mean, almost my whole career. At first, I was an evangelical at this Lutheran college in Virginia, and I was out of sorts there. And, if you keep your views to yourself, well, you'll never have any strife. But if you think your views are important enough to make a difference and speak up, and then you start writing about it, which I did. I'm just a compulsive writer, I guess. Yes. So I've had lots and lots and lots of theological conflict for about 40 years. I try to speak the truth in love and not in arrogance. And I try to stay friends with the people I disagree with. That happens much of the time, not all the time. So yes, it has caused conflicts. Yeah.
Another question I was thinking about as you were speaking is that we know through history that supersessionism, the fruits of supersessionism, in one way or another, have been devastating for the Jews. I would say also for us as Christians in our testimony, our witness for the Lord. But anyway, for the Jews, it has meant for them discrimination, persecution, forced conversions, ghettos, pogroms, and the Holocaust, of course. So in light of all that, why do you think that people still hold to supersessionism?
Well, I think, Professor, as I was saying, it's all they know. That's what they've been taught. It's all I knew. It's what I was taught. And some extremely smart and extremely skillful theologians, and some of the most influential theologians and biblical scholars have taught and continue to teach it. And their pastors teach it because they've been taught it in seminary. But I don't want to question on that entire changing. More and more scholars are like me and are part of what's called the new Christian Zionism, which I think you also want to talk about here in the interview. And each year, the biggest assembly of worldwide religion scholars in Bible and theology and world religions and history and scripture come together in the United States generally, and it's the combined meetings of the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature. And about 8 years ago, a few of us started a new society there called the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology.
Right.
And we debated word, but it's becoming it is starting to reach the point where people know supersessionism is thought to be a bad thing. Now, they disagree about what it is and whether or not it's a bad thing, but it's starting to become a suspicious word, whereas it never was before. And that's a good thing to me. So things are getting better.
Well, that's good to hear, actually. Now, as we approach the end of this conversation on supersessionism, I also wanted to know if you have any practical advice, an advice that would help us engage those who still hold to supersessionism as the historic or standard position of the Christian church throughout history. What would you say? What would you share with us in closing?
Well, I would say to your friends and your pastors, and I'm speaking to your audience, and maybe even your professors who are still supersessionists, I would recommend that you recommend them to start reading some things they probably have never seen before. Just as my guide in Israel gave me new authors and new books and articles to read, do the same. You might recommend a groundbreaking book by Soulen, Soulen, called The God of Israel and Christian Theology.
Right.
Or Mark Kinzer. Now, Mark Kinzer is probably the most accomplished messianic theologian in the world, Mark Kinzer, Kinzer, and his groundbreaking book is called Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism. If those in your audience are from a Reformed, you might, and you want to read something short, you could, and if you wouldn't mind reading something by this guy McDermott, you can go and just Google this, Gospel Coalition. I published this article about 7 or 8 years ago. It is called The Reformed Tradition on Israel is Diverse. The Reformed Tradition on Israel is Diverse. So just type in Gospel Coalition, McDermott, and the Reformed Tradition, and it should.
Right. We'll put all those links down below, by the way.
Okay. And then, if you don't really like to read that much or you want to recommend some things, I've done many, many podcasts and many things on YouTube. I think you can type in YouTube, Gerald McDermott in Israel, and lots of things will come up. I've done lots and lots of interviews like this over the years. And then one short book that I've done for people in the pews, and I might recommend this to your pastors or your friends. In fact, my theologian friends prefer this to my longer, very scholarly book is called The New Christian Zionism, but a shorter book that I tried to write, not for fellow scholars, but for people in the pews, is called Israel Matters. Israel Matters. And it's all my books are on Amazon. So it's right there at Amazon.
Right. And I highly recommend it, by the way. Israel Matters was also very influential in my own thinking about supersessionism, as well as some of the titles that you have mentioned. Well, Dr. McDermott, thank you very much for this lovely conversation. And indeed, we are going to talk in another episode of our podcast about New Christian Zionism. For now, thank you very much for being with us, for your time, and God bless.
Well, thank you, Professor. It's been my pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you want to know more about King's Evangelical Divinity School, visit our website, kingsdivinity.org, or follow us on social media. We will be more than glad to have you study with us if you are interested in any of our courses. See you on our next podcast.